So we guys welcome Norris.
All right. People often ask me, well, what is a chaplain? What's the difference between a chaplain and a pastor? Well, the first thing, the difference between a chaplain and a pastor is chaplains are usually paid more. No. I am what you call a professional chaplain, and that's a snooty sound to me, so I like to change it to career chaplain. It means that I've been employed by hospitals or by the military over the years to be a chaplain in an institution. It also means, kind of a strange thing, it means that, yes, I'm a Baptist, but I'm an ordained Southern Baptist. But as a chaplain, I come in to visit you at a hospital room, and my first question is, do you have any kind of spirituality? Tell me about what you believe about God, because those are the important things in this relationship inside the hospital room. So I promise you I will never thump you with a 50-pound Bible if I come to see you. I will always talk about where you are, and that's what's important. Some people have criticized me both in columns as they learn what chaplains are, or others they say, well how are you going to, you're missing some opportunities to tell people about Jesus. Yes and no. If they put an evangelist in my job, the hospital would, as they did in our community, escort him out of the hospital with security. So I'm in a unique position to answer questions and to be available to people who have questions about their spirituality. So I tell people this, as a hospital chaplain, I have taped crystals to people's wrists. I have turned the bed in the feng shui direction. I've put garlic under the bed. I've taken off my shoes and burned incense, and I have read from the Quran. I have placed the Quran on the forehead of a dying child. I have in one instance I gathered some water to take into the patient so that the patient's shaman could spit on him. None of those things meant anything to me. But if I am to provide people hope, they have to be comforted in their language and in their tradition and in their faith. When I tell people all that and I say, well, on Sunday morning I'm a Southern Baptist, don't worry about it. So, I sing in my tradition. Sometimes I dance until my wife stops me. Because people get hurt when I dance, it's just a thing. So that's what a chaplain is. A career chaplain is someone bringing hope to people where they are in their faith traditions. So it doesn't mean that I agree with every one of them. It doesn't mean that I promote them. It just means that I'm able to be there when they're dying. I had my predecessor chaplain, she said, the biggest honor a chaplain has is to be a stranger who's invited in at a time like that. Can you imagine? Someone's dying in the hospital. I want a stranger to talk to. Has he got one here? That's the chaplain. And so I honor that, and I don't try to disrespect that. But I have had opportunities to present the gospel. When I had, in one case, this man's laying on the bed, and in the emergency room, he had fallen in his yard in 105-degree heat all day long, and his family's gathered. I asked his wife, well, what are you? She says, I'm Buddhist. So, okay, so we're going to offer some silence and some presents and some, And I'm standing around this gurney with the sons until I hear one of them say, Dad, we tried to tell you about Jesus before. You need to listen now. I'm like, okay. and so I'm praying in my language, and out comes this. And so this is how I see Christ presented in places where my pastor wouldn't be able to come, but because I honor that moment, Christ can be there. So what is a chaplain? Well, I would say this in the way of stories, and I'm going to tell you about 4 stories. A good friend of mine suggested once that that I nickname my column America's Favorite Chaplain to promote my public speeches. You're America's favorite chaplain. And so that's very nice of you, Andy, but I think that's a little bit over the top, don't you? I prefer the moniker the bomb dump chaplain. His quizzical expression showed me that he needed more understanding. I told him in 1994 I took my first active duty assignment at a place called Onizuka Air Station, just outside of San Jose, California. And so I was informed one day by our supervisor, Jim Young. He said, we've got an upcoming inspection from the command chaplain's office in Denver. Now, in civilian lingo, the command chaplain would be like getting a visit, your church getting a visit from the bishop or your district overseer. And so in the upcoming weeks, we worked very hard, all of us chaplains, starching our uniforms, vigorously varnishing the prayer benches, and we were just exhausted. And we were told that we needed to prepare something called the unit visitation statistics. The report, our boss told us, should include an account of all your interactions with airmen on base. And I'm like, how do you define interactions? Well, that's up to you, my boss said, handing us the form. Don't forget to record where your interactions take place. So ours was a young, ambitious staff, and we wanted to look as good as possible, and so we're generating as many numbers as possible. We busied ourselves crisscrossing the base the next week. We'd stroll to the gym and the dining hall, and we'd greet all the passerbyers. Hey, Airman so-and-so. Oh, hi, Chaplain. Dunk, 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 ping, ping, ping. Documenting all these pastoral visits we were getting, right? We weren't even breaking a sweat. Yes, a lot of officers, chaplains, can be competitive, meaning we were engaging in this bureaucratic thing we call pencil whipping. You know what that is? Just kind of building the numbers, manipulating the stats, and a simple slide we would present to the visiting commander. Command Chaplain Colonel Benjamin Perez. He arrived bright early one morning, met us in the fellowship hall. Perez was this short, steely-eyed Texan. And he had these keen anecdotes that he would tell us, and he says, look, I'm only here to help. Have you ever heard that from the command center? Like, I'm only here to help. You know, if somebody's here just to help, they're not. So, but he's a good command chaplain, and he was among the sharpest I had seen, and he saw past those manipulated statistics. Holding our reports in hand, he posed his signature question. How many of you chaplains have been to the bomb dump? Now, the bomb dump is the unofficial the unofficial name for the place on base where they store hazardous explosive devices, where they're rendered safe. They're not the celebrated bomb squad, you know, the macho thing. They're just engineers. They're just trying to make this a safer base. They're on the forgotten side of the base. Now, here's the funny thing that Perez knew. This was a satellite communications base. We had no bombs. We moved satellites, literally, with our dishes. We said, you go over here, you go over here. We moved them in the sky. And so he knew that. Nevertheless, the trajectory of my ministry that day would change in a somewhat slight but significant way. What Perez meant was the bomb dump was a euphemism for a place populated by the forgotten people. He didn't care how many visits we were making to headquarters or the gym. He wanted to know if we knew the names of our cleaning staff. Did we know the names of the subordinates and their families by first names? His question about the bomb dump was a not so subtle reminder to chaplains who, we knew a thing or two what he was trying to say. Without quoting Matthew 25, he was giving us the lesson, where Jesus taught that caring for those of a lesser privilege, the prisoner, the sick, the immigrant, was the equivalent of caring for Jesus himself. Truly, I tell you, Jesus said, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So anyone working in the bomb dump might be well counted, I think, wouldn't you think, among the least of these? That's why Perez considered visits made to these secluded and these foreign sides of the base to be the test of a real chaplain. His question became the guiding reminder early in my career that while statistics remain a necessary tool, they aren't the mission. People are the mission. So perhaps one day you will help me become known as America's favorite chaplain. My wife would prefer that you didn't allow me to be that. For now, I'll settle for being called the bomb dump chaplain. Now that story and many stories that I'll tell tonight, they are included in a third book that I wrote called Thriving Beyond Surviving. The book was born a few months, let me just tell you how it was born. It was a few months after I read this announcement to my wife. I said, I'm going to enter a modeling contest, I told Becky one day. I was at the same time putting on my rather skimpy running shorts. I was actually proud of what I'd fit into after the marathon running. And so she said, I didn't know your running costume qualifies you for Chippendales. Now, I've already been clear. My wife's not that funny, but she knows how to kick me. So, no, not that kind of modeling. I just read in the AARP magazine that they were seeking contestants for their New Faces of 50 Plus People model search. And all you had to do was to write a little essay about what you do to maintain your health and your spiritual well-being. And so I was going to enter that contest. She seemed relieved that I wasn't going to model in my underwear, but she wanted more proof that I was not in this midlife crisis. And so I read her the submission guidelines. I said, it says here, she says, share your wisdom for living your best life at 50 by submitting your photo and telling us how you embrace your age. But I was a few years younger then, and so I embraced it a lot better. So out of that, I wrote this submission called The 7 F Words for the 50s, and the book was born. And so there's a few things in the book that I write about, and one of them is, there's 7 things. I'm not going to probably go over all 7 unless, okay, so I have about 15 more minutes, and then we're done. But I wrote about fitness. I talked about golf keeps me thriving through the neighborhood, and running marathons and half marathons stretched me beyond what I ever thought I was physically able to do. But the second one I wrote, I'm going to skip through some of these. I'm not going to give you a whole fitness lecture, but the second one was friends and family. And so my best experience of family is, of course, with my wife and my children. But family can be an endearing term. It can be a changing term. And so friends can sometimes be included in that word family. Now, if you were at all a Friends fan of the NBC show Friends, you remember one of the Phoebe, the character, was said to have coined the term BFF, best friends forever, right? And so I have a best friend, and I'm proud to describe his name as in part of my searching for this fabulous 50s living. I have a friend, a BFF. That's the second F word. Friends, family, 44 years. But I'm going to tell you something. He shouldn't have ever become my friend. He shouldn't have ever become my friend because I met him in 1976 at a Baylor University party of 100 California students. I snubbed him. The guy had long hair, and I had short hair, and I was in ROTC. I was a short-haired, Pepsi-drinking ROTC guy, and Roger was a beer-drinking fan of KISS, the American hard rock band. He constantly irritated me with his loud music, and I reciprocated by playing the most hated song. He did not like Neil Diamond, let me tell you what. So I know, right? Like, who would friend this guy? But we did agree on Linda Ronstadt. So we were roommates who shouldn't have ever become BFFs. And really, I hated sports. The only sport that I really could get into a little bit was football at Baylor, because you could take a date to football, but you had to wear a tie or a suit to go to a football game. Don't ask me to explain more. But it was better than taking the date on the back of my 10-speed, because he had a Chevy Vegas. So we came to these games, and we would have dates, and we were both on the ministerial track, and Roger didn't talk about his ministry, but I proudly announced that I had a double major in religion and journalism, and Roger kept a low profile with his sociology major, and we both took Greek. And how many of you taken Greek? This is how Roger answered the first test. How do you decline Sue? S-U, that's the word for you. He wrote on the test, Sue, S-U, S-U-E, S-U-S-A-N, S-U-S, he spelled Sue, Susanna, Suzanne, and then he left. That was our first test. So that's what he looked like. And I definitely should not have brought him to church with me. Should have never done that. I was in my three-piece suit. He was in his bell-bottom cords. He liked to question the Sunday school teacher. I like to be the Sunday school teacher. And so we pledged to this ministerial fraternity, and I wore my shirt, and he had on the back, he had the word "the dreamer." I thought, well, that sounds very theological. And then I found out it was his Aerosmith song, "Dream On," that he was talking about. So we never should have been best friends, but we were. We attended the same seminary together. Our wives, we were best friends at each other's wedding. And our wives, we had children just months apart. And eventually I would introduce him to healthcare chaplaincy, and he found his inspiration there. And so 40 years, Roger and I sustained a relationship of friends that keep people going. And we always lived more than 90 minutes apart. Well, what made us friends? I think we became friends because we honored our differences. We never demanded that the other change. We learned from each other. We looked out for each other. We saw each other's heart before we heard each other's words. In these days of division, I want to encourage you to look in unexpected places, to find an unforeseen friend like Roger. Seek people of different colors, of dissimilar political persuasions, of unique sexual orientations. Reach out to those who have facial piercings, men with, where's Pastor? Beards. Women with outrageous hair color. And yes, wait for it, men with tattoos. Don't avoid differences or demand similarities. Find each other's heart. It doesn't have to be difficult. I just ask you to walk up to somebody this week and introduce yourself and tell them Roger sent you. I dedicated my first book to Roger. Oh, good, there's one laying right here. We didn't put that there on purpose, though, right? Right? Right here in the front of the first book I wrote. To my wife's, surprise, she wasn't hurt. To Roger, my life. She told me not to go here. My lifelong friend, this book is dedicated to you and your struggle and victory over a double bout of cancer. I want to bite. 8 months ago, Roger was diagnosed with his fourth of acidic cell carcinoma, and he was placed in hospice. Then on the last Sunday in September, we sat on his couch shoulder to shoulder as we'd stood for 45 years. We said our temporary goodbyes, and I held his cooling hand, and I laid my head on his shoulder, and then in between sobs, I told him that he was my best friend ever, BFF. I told him I was sorry that I'd moved so far away, because now we were living almost 2 hours apart. That's okay, Norris. It's all right. Soon he was asleep, and 4 days later, Roger died at 63 years of age. Roger, my best friend forever. Have a best friend. Find a good friend. Be a friend. My BFF and I shared another F word. We shared finances. He was a mess with his finances. His wife worked for Bank of America. But I was ever so proud after he died to find out that he had paid. Mind you now, some of you know how difficult this would be to pay for life insurance after 4 bouts with cancer. He had managed to pay $250,000. Finances are for taking care of people. Nothing else. Finances is another F word that I use, but they should only be spent on people and places and things that you do. You have to spend something on your house. You have to spend something on charity and others, but spend it on people. Spend it on experiences. Spend it on, and this is the only F word that I stretched a little bit, F for flight or travel. Spend it on travel. My preaching professor lived in a hut, seminary professor. Why do you do that? He lived in a duplex. I said, I use my money for travel. He taught me that very early, to say, because when we travel outside of ourselves. We learn things about ourselves. We learn things about who we are. We learn things about the world is not black and white, like we'd like to be told. So spend your finances on people and experiences. One word I'll say about travel is that we've been traveling a lot. Some of you have been reading my columns about the Chispa Project. And so we go down to Honduras. We take a group of people. We've been taking them every March or so. So look for that soon. I'd love to take you to Honduras with us. And so we start libraries in elementary schools. And it will change you to be there, just to change you, to see why do all those people line up to risk their lives to come here? I just asked a question, and I'm not going to answer it. I'm asking you, think about it. What would make you stand up right here from Marion? How bad would life have to be for you to stand up right now and walk 3,000 miles? How? It's bad, folks. Coming to Honduras will change you. Now, I have 2 more stories I got to get through. So am I talking too fast? No? Yes? No? Okay. So I got this. So another F word, I may have missed one along the way, is fun. Now look, let me tell you who the funniest person in this room is. Take your finger and go. You should be the funniest. If you're not laughing at yourself, believe me, then a lot of people will laugh at you. And you don't want that. So I'm always telling my wife, I'm always telling her, you know, you're so lucky because I tell you the stupid stuff I do. Most husbands don't do that. I want you to know the silly things that I do. So, you know, like when I was in Iraq 10 years ago, you know, I just went ahead and admitted a couple of times, yeah, I get those words confused with now I'm losing my track here. Here it is. Wait a minute. It is the explosive IEDs. In Iraq, I would sometimes ask the doctor, was he hit by an IUD? That's not the way that works, chaplain. And so we would laugh. And if you can't say, I made a stupid mistake, aren't we funny? So, I mean, this is the story I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time. I've done it before, and I've gotten 1 or 2, how dare you tell that story in a church. So, you know what, if you're, let's leave early now. So, but this is a military hat worn by a proud Vietnam veteran, right? But in the military, in active duty military today, they will wear these they call them ball caps. They belong to their unit, so it'll say 222nd or whatever up on the top. And this is how we wear them in the office. Like I said, did you wash this hat? Did you? So this is where we put them when we're indoors. We put it, well, it rides behind the hat, or it rides behind the blouse, so it's down here. So one day I was in Saudi Arabia, deployed, far from home, and I just had a pretty big breakfast. So most of you know where that's going. So anyway, it was time to, as we say in runner, this is a runner's term, evacuate. Right? How many runners we got here? Evacuate. We know what that means. And so it was time for me to go to the restroom and evacuate. So I won't reenact, all this part, and but do you know these things don't make a sound when dropped on porcelain? And so, I did what all of us do here. I don't know why anyone would be offended by that. We do what all of us do. And so I stood up. We could talk about whether you should stand up to do your paperwork or sit up. But anyway, so I stood up and I looked back there and there's a hat. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, chaplain, just run, just forget it. Okay, but there's two problems with that. It's one, my mom taught me to put my name on everything. And two, it had a chaplain's cross. You can't leave a chaplain's cross in the toilet. So a little biohazard project, and I had it and I threw it away, of course. But so I went to the commissary, or the BX, to buy. That's our Walmart. To buy a hat, and the guy goes, "You're deployed." Yeah, I know that. We don't sell hats in the BX. And where do I get a hat? You have to get them from your NCO. Now, your NCO is an office manager, right? So I went back to my NCO, and his name is Mike, and he goes, Mike, I lost my hat, and I need a new one. He goes, oh, yeah, I can get you a new hat. He goes, how'd you lose it? I go, he goes, no, chaplain, just tell me, I'll help you find it. And he's looking around the office, I said, yeah, well, and so I told him the story. And as I tell him the story about, how you sit down and he starts doing this. You know how when your belly just can't contain the laughter, so you just got to give it. And so he's just cracking up. He's slapping his knee. He's just cracking up. And he says, chaplain, he says, I need you to give me one good reason I should give you a new hat after that. And I said, it's easy. I said, a lot of officers have a hat full of crap, but this one's going to admit it. He fell on the ground yelling, chaplain, you got a hat. You got a hat. So, if you can't admit that sometimes you just goof up and you make a mistake, you're not having fun in life. You're not having fun at all. I want to tell a story about the last story about faith. I have a very powerful story that I want to talk about forgiveness, but I'm not going to use it tonight because I think some of you have heard it. It's in the book about from Iraq. It is the powerful story. I'm not going to tease you. I'm just going to tell you a little bit, but it's about a man who was in who did get hit by an IED, and his squad leader was killed, and so this guy called me. His name is Sergeant Crawford. Called me to his bedside to ask if I would help him pray for God to forgive these enemies. It's a very powerful story. I hope you'll read it, and I'd be happy. You don't have to buy the book. I'll email it to you. It's just a powerful story, and it persuades us all to forgive. But the last thing I want to talk about tonight is faith. Faith. It's no surprise here, right? Even for a chaplain, faith is like a good marriage. It requires work, and for me, faith is something that embraces me, and it keeps me from falling when all else fails. Faith, I've described in one of my columns, as the grip the parachutist feels. When you're falling and suddenly you're saved. Your harness tightens. It's the grasp of the trapeze artist feels in midair when she hangs on only to be snatched by a skillful partner. It's the clutch that embraces you just beyond that edge of darkness that you move into, because it comes from the light. When I keep the faith, I discover that faith keeps me. Faith is a heart message. And I tried to share that faith with a man, one of my very first patients I ever saw. And I don't know why, I'll never forget his name. His name is Mr. Penny. I don't know his first name because that's not how he introduced himself. He said, "I'm Mr. Penny, chaplain." As I entered his room at the Houston Northwest Medical Center in 1992, I reciprocated his formality. I said, "Well, I'm Chaplain Burkes." And the truth is that I always like it better when patients call me pastor, because pastor was a loving term that said, "I trust you." Chaplain was a title that says, "I don't know you yet." And it seemed like a more personal note. And so I thought he was just using the titles to recognize our age difference, but eventually I decided that he wanted to distance himself from this three-piece suit. Yes, I lived in Houston, so yes, a three-piece suit chaplain who matched his stereotypical idea of a preacher. Penny had been advised that his brain tumor was inoperable, but he didn't want to talk about that. The balding, bony man just wanted to chat. During the next several hospital visits, he talked about sports, or either the Houston Oilers, or he wanted to know how my lunchtime basketball game went with my local clergy colleagues. And Penny, the greater the emotional distance for Mr. Penny, the better, I think. Finally, through his last hospitalization, his nurse summoned me from lunch to tell me that Penny had a favor to ask. And thinking that it sounded like a call for maybe his deathbed confessions, I made a quick exit from the cafeteria, which isn't easy for me, to the ICU. And I walked into his room, and his wife is stroking his fevered forehead. And his wife says, "He wants to ask you something." And I looked at that figure on the bed, twisted and ghostly. His raspy breathing suggested that he wouldn't have much strength for this conversation. So I leaned over the bed and I called to him as if announcing my presence through a fog. "Mr. Penny, Mr. Penny, it's Chaplain Burkes. Is there something that you want to ask me?" And he nodded, and I still remember the raspy voice. Teach me. His voice trailed. I didn't understand, but he took a fuller breath and he said, "Teach me to pray." I was confused by this sudden approach to an intimate moment. And I looked over and searched his wife's face for context, and she's chewing on a thumbnail, and she says, "He's embarrassed." Embarrassed? For what? He's afraid he's being hypocritical to wait to this very last moment to talk to God. I nodded. It's a common thing I get from patients. Even hospice patients will say, it almost cracks me up. I said it last week, "No, I'm not ready to talk to a chaplain." "Well, when will you be ready? Like you're on hospice right now." And so it was something that I recognized from other patients. But see, Jesus summarily dismissed that kind of poor logic in his conversations with two revolutionaries who occupied crosses on either side of him. The first man spent his last hours mocking Jesus and goading him to use his power to save everyone. But the other guy, he was quite the opposite. He felt the shame for his past life. And he asked Jesus, "Remember me when you enter your kingdom." Jesus swiftly responded, Today you'll be with me in paradise." Instead of disqualifying this dying man for being hypocritically tardy, Jesus assured him that he would be awarded in the most promptest fashion. "Mr. Penny," I said, "I think you'll find that God cares very little about your past. He mostly cares what you are going to do with this very next minute of your life." Penny nodded. Prayer is just talking to God. It's not theologically complicated. Just talk to God with all your heart. Penny closed his eyes, and he began moving his lips, and I could never tell you what he said. But when he opened his eyes, his expression told me that he had heard God's voice. I know this because the Mr. Penny, who had been so dependent on titles to gain distance from spiritual matters, shifted his heart, and I kid you not, to say this one last thing to me. Thank you, Pastor. Thank you. Now, if you don't have faith, you don't have the most important F word you'll ever know. That without it, you're lost. And so, I hope I can get to come back one day. I want to talk to you about forgiveness, the most powerful word on the planet. And I want to talk to you about why our churches need to forgive before we can ever strive beyond that. Thanks again for letting me come, and I appreciate all of you being out here on this evening. And so blessings to you, and let's pray. Heavenly Father, we know that you are in this place. We know that we experience you as the most loving and forgiving being, and we know that that forgiveness awaits us for all who follow. We ask this prayer today in Jesus' name, amen.